When I first started working on nuclear structure, I tried to decide a shape of a particle that could be fitted together mechanically so that the nucleus of the various elements could all be fitted together in a mechanical process. I came up with the idea of the circlon, a circular shaped particle that's hollow in the middle, like a hollow ring. If you had a microscope which allowed you to peer down to the very nucleus and be able to see the structures at their fundamental levels, all you would see is these circlon-shaped particles.
How did you come to meet Jim Carter?
I met Jim through a very unlikely sequence of events. When I was researching my first book, Pythagoras' Trousers, I used to buy a lot of second-hand books from this academic bookseller in LA. And one day I was picking up the complete works of Descartes when she handed me a package and said, "This arrived in the mail today. I was about to throw it into the bin when I thought of you." Never quite known why she thought of me, but it was an announcement from Jim Carter about the imminent self-publication of a book which claimed to be a complete alternative theory of physics. And I was rather intrigued by this because he included in the package a wall chart on the one side of which was his alternative theory of the creation of the universe, and on the other side his alternative theory of the periodic table. And I thought this was an interesting and visually stunning body of work. So we started corresponding.
And this, of course, is not Jimmy Carter, the engineer who was President of the United States. This is Jim Carter, who lived in the, boondocks in some ways, repairing cars and trucks.
Yes, Jim he has no education beyond high school. He has been a gold miner, an abalone diver. He's gone in search of lost meteorites. He's dug secret caves with a hand chisel underneath his property. And he lives in a beautiful piece of property about an hour south of Seattle, in a beautiful piece of forest on top of a cliff. And he runs a trailer park there. He's the proprietor of the trailer park, and they do everything from install the sewer lines and the power lines, and he has a fleet of old Chryslers and Cadillacs that he lovingly repairs. And Jim sees the universe as a giant machine. Just as he believes he can lift up the hood of a car and understand the machinery there, so too he believes he can, as it were, lift up the hood of the universe and understand the cosmic machine.
Well, of course, if I receive a book like that, and I have done on many an occasion, the first thing I do is, with tongs, put it over there in the far distance. And yet you do the opposite. You not only look at it and read it, you also get in touch with Jim. How did you manage to reach him?
Oh, well, it wasn't at all easy to find him because he had his address and phone number on his letter that he sent out.
So just gave him a call?
Well, yeah, I mean, he wanted feedback. So I gave him a call, and I happened to be going up to give a lecture in that area. And so I just hired a car and went out to visit him. And it never crossed my mind when I first encountered this subject of what I've come to call outsider physics that I would write a book about it. I thought it was an interesting subject potentially for a magazine article. But I became fascinated by Jim's life, this bizarre sort of fantastical universe that he inhabited, where he was literally doing things like going off in search for meteorites and dreaming up his own theory of physics and building his own house and building his own cars. And it occurred to me that what he was doing, that Jim lived the ultimate American pioneer dream. He was the DIY person, and that sort of American pioneer spirit that is celebrated in so much movies, it's part of the mythos of America, actually is pretty absent now, where most people have become, really dependent on experts. They can't fix things themselves. And Jim was an embodiment of this sort of mythical American persona, and he extended it to building his own universe, this DIY enthusiasm taken to the ultimate extreme. And I became fascinated, what drives a person like that? And given that he's not alone, that there are now thousands of these people, what drives them collectively? What does it say about our society's relationship to science, to physics, that they feel the need to reinvent it from the ground up in their basements?
But you see, he also built a machine that has smoke rings coming out of it, very nice ones. And those smoke rings are also part of his general theory. How?
Jim believes that at the subatomic level, everything is made up from these little ring-shaped particles that he calls circlons. So he sees the periodic table, for instance, the atomic elements, being his model of them is like a kind of subatomic chain mail with these little rings linked together in these rather complex and rather beautiful patterns. And so he's interested in how can he test his theories about the way these circlon particles behave. And smoke rings are one incarnation at the human scale of circlon-shaped phenomena. So Jim bashes smoke rings together in his backyard to test how he thinks these particles are behaving. And it's really quite beautiful when you see these things sailing across his lawn and you realise how long-lived they are, how internally stable they are. And what's fascinating to me about Jim's theory is that he's not the first person who's had this theory, that actually in the 19th century, two of the great British scientists of the 19th century, Lord Kelvin, William Thomson, who we all know he discovered
Degrees
absolute
Kelvin,
zero,
yeah.
and degrees Kelvin is named after him. He and his colleague, the great mathematician Peter Guthrie Tait, in the 1870s, conceived of a similar theory. They were interested in the question, which was big in the 19th century psychology, what are atoms made from? Atoms must be made of some smaller constituent parts. Those parts must be very long-lived and stable. What are they? And Tait and Thomson spent 30 years trying to demonstrate, by bashing smoke rings together, that atoms were made up of some kind of subatomic version of smoke rings. So I find that fascinating. Here you have some of the leaders of modern physics and Jim Carter, separated by 150 years.
In this grand cosmology that Jim Carter produced, is there any real substance to it at all?
In the terms that you really want to know, Robin, which is it ever going to be taught in Harvard and Princeton? Is he ever going to win the Nobel Prize? The answer is definitively no. I don't believe that Jim's theories or any of the outsiders that I've encountered would ever be taught at University Physics Department, and I don't believe they should be. None of them are the next Einstein, although I should say all of them believe they're the next Einstein. And so that raises the question, well, why am I wasting my time on this rubbish? Why have I spent
why?
years
And writing a book about
writing a book about people who I don't believe are ever going to be validated in the academic sphere? The reason that it fascinates me and why I think it's worth reflecting on is this. At the beginning of the 20th century, some people in the art world began to recognise that there were people outside the mainstream art world who were doing art. Mostly they lived in lunatic asylums. And we invented the term art brut or outsider art. And at the time, most people in the art mainstream would not take it seriously, wouldn't even consider it. But over the past few decades, it's become a huge category of the art world. There are whole books, magazines, conferences, degrees, galleries devoted to it. I see this subject that I'm approaching as a similar question. There is this huge emerging world of people who are rejecting mainstream physics or trying to do physics on their own terms. I'm interested in it as a sociological phenomena. We don't expect to validate outsider art in the same terms or to judge it in the same terms that we judge Picasso or Rembrandt. I don't think we can judge outsider physics in the same terms that we judge Einstein and Newton. What can we say about it? What does it tell us about our society's relationship to science? And I think that's sociologically, it's a worthwhile question.
Well, of course, with art, it has a validity depending on whether anyone actually enjoys it. You know, if it does make any difference. With science, it's got to relate to nature. I mean, nature is the ultimate arbiter of whether your equations, whether your theories, whether your rocks and the interpretation of bones actually comes off or not. But the thing I find fascinating about Jim Carter and the like is what you say in your book about the fact that we are now in a world where we cannot understand the very simple machinery of everyday life. Because in the old days, if you tinkered with a motor car, you could actually see how those levers and how those nozzles and how everything else kind of worked. You famously took things apart and put them together again. You can't do that with black boxes in motor cars now. Everything is virtually a black box. And what you describe about Jim is that he was actually doing those things with those cars, the Chryslers and all the rest of it. And his physics seemed to be a kind of cry for something that was tangible about science that had become intangible with all those strings and all those quantums and all those strange abstractions. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that captures it very well, Robin. Physics, in some sense, has become a victim of its own success. Even apart from something like string theory, let's go to the ones that we really feel sure about. Quantum theory, general relativity. They are descriptions of the universe based on very complicated, difficult to understand mathematics. I mean, even most physicists don't understand these kinds of mathematical abstractions. So, but yet they work. You know, GPS satellites use corrections from both special and but both special and general relativity, which is mind-blowing. So on some profound level, these theories are right. They literally work and we run our lives by them. But the descriptions of reality have become so inaccessible that 99% of the population can't understand them. Now, Stuart Kauffman, the complexity theorist, famously said that one of the points of science is to help us to feel at home in the cosmos. And that's been a cry that's been taken up over the past 10 years by a lot of champions of science, including people like Stephen Weinberg, Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins. And I believe this. I do think science should help us to feel at home in the cosmos. But if the articulation of the science is inaccessible to 99% of the population, then who gets to feel at home in the cosmos? What Jim and the Outsiders are saying is we believe science is the right way to describe the world. We're absolutely pro-science. We look at the science that we read about, and we know they try to read Stephen Hawking, they try to read Brian Greene. I say it just comes across to them as incomprehensible gobbledygook. They don't feel at home in that universe. And so they say we need to have a new science that I can feel at home in. And I think this is a very, very serious social problem at the moment. If our descriptions of the universe are inaccessible, what do we expect people to do? Some people give up and just say, well, I'll never understand that. Some people do what the creationists are doing and say, well, I reject it altogether.
And try to undermine it.
And try to undermine it. My people are actually, I think, doing something rather brave and courageous. They say, we can understand science, but it has to be reconceived. Now, whether you and I agree with them, I think those of us who love science are called upon to respond to this issue.
Yeah. The difference between you and me is you can actually do the maths and I can't. So I'd like to think that I'm part of you and me, but I suspect I'm not in that league. But how did you get on with Jim, personally? You've known him for years. Jim
is a wonderful man to be with. And I have to say, I've come to understand, since meeting many hundreds of outsiders since Jim, that I'm extremely lucky that he was the first one I ran into. The biggest quality about Jim that is so rare is he has a sense of humour. He's got a really beautiful, wicked sense of humour. And although he truly believes he's the next Newton, he can also joke about his position as an outsider. Most of them are so deadly serious. And they're also very angry about their, as it were, exclusion. They don't understand why the mainstream is rejecting them. Whereas Jim is almost so certain that he's the next Newton. His feathers don't get ruffled like a lot of the others.
Newton, when he was a little boy, was always making all these models of things, carving wood models of clocks and all kinds of things. Even when he was very little, he had a whole little set of tools and was always making something mechanical. And, I can identify with Newton in a lot of ways because his idea of a mechanical universe is basically very similar to mine.
He's also just had an amazing life. It's extraordinary to spend time with somebody who's digging a secret cave out of the cliff beneath his house. I've come to have immense admiration for this man who can physically do anything.
Yeah, well, Jim may be an absolutely charming fellow, but how does he feel about being exposed to be wrong? You know, someone works out that this doesn't operate and your whole theory's failed. Is he scared of that?
Well, one can probably rest assured that that's not going to happen, Robin, because most physicists won't give this stuff the time of day. So, you know, he would love it if he could get some concrete feedback from a physicist. That's what many of them want, but they can't get any response at all.
I see.
But let's say it happened, and I do know of one or two cases where a mainstream physicist has given an outsider feedback. And what tends to happen is that, and I find this when I talk with Jim, if you gently sort of point out, well, what about this kind of rather logical difficulty in your theory, what they will do is they will usually find some elaborate sequence of events in their theory why this actually works, despite whatever it is you've said. So these people are psychologically extremely good at, as it were, finding a patchwork fix. Yeah. And you get to realise after a time, I mean, I used to try this gently with Jim, and then I realised after a while, look, there's no point in that. You know, the whole thing, from the point of view of a mainstream physicist, the whole thing doesn't stand up from the word go. If one's going to try to deal with this, there's no point in dealing with it on that level. It's so manifestly wrong from the ground up. But I'm interested in how they proceed with the science totally on their own.
And what they do with it, because you see, not only is it useful, as you said in the beginning, you can make, you know, with quantum theory, you can make electronics, which is how we're operating the studio. With relativity, you can operate GPS. But with these way out theories, they fit nowhere else in the world, not even with another loony theory. You know, there's very little mesh with anything.
Yes.
And that's the problem. That's what makes it totally different.
Exactly. I mean, there is no essential ecology here. So one of the huge things about modern science is that it is created by hundreds, if not thousands of years of history, by people working in certain traditions together in vast numbers. And we've got to this point because thousands of people beforehand have made contributions to it. It is a collective theory. Whether it's right or wrong, it is something that thousands of people have contributed to. And these people like Jim, they're an ecology of one. They're complete outliers. That is a huge problem for them because they don't share even often the fundamentals of what they think science should be with the people, with their own colleagues.
I belong to a group of dissident physicists called the Natural Philosophy Alliance, and there's a bunch of different people with very different ideas, and some of them it's easy to pick them apart and show that they don't really know what they're talking about. Other ones have some interesting ideas and have gone to a lot of work to explain their theories in ways that can be somewhat convincing. The general consensus of the NPA people is that they believe in ether, kind of pre-Einstein kind of theories that they are trying to develop. My theory is really very different, so I'm kind of an outsider there, even among the outsiders.
So it's very, very difficult to see how any of these theories could ever get any traction, even amongst themselves. Of course, they don't care about traction amongst themselves, they care about traction amongst the mainstream. And so in that sense, one could say it is a kind of madness because it's such an isolated, alone activity. It is a form of madness in some sense that is growing. In the last few years, the Natural Philosophy Alliance, which is the group that Jim helped to found, now has an international, it's got a huge database, a huge website. They have 600 bona fide outsider theorists all around the world. Between them, they've produced like 300 books and 250 websites. They have video stream conferences every week. They have a conference. They produce a huge conference book of 700 pages of 120
Really?
theories. That's one. And there's an even bigger organisation called the Electric Universe. That group of people actually have something in common. This is a growing phenomena. I don't think it's going to go away. It's an index of certain things about our society's relationship to science.
Before I ask you about that, I want to know, are they all Jims, or is there
Janes.
the odd Jane there?
There is the very, very rare Jane. They are almost universally men.
All guys, yeah.
Almost any other presupposition people have is wrong. They come from across the socioeconomic spectrum. They're all ages. They come from all professions. I've met one who's a California Supreme Court judge. There's a famous Hollywood film director, Walter Murch, who cut a number of the Godfather films, who is a legend in Hollywood and has won 3 Academy Awards. He has an outsider physics theory. I've met artists, poets, backyard car dealers. The biggest category of them are engineers. So quite a lot of them are engineers. Some of them are actually people with degrees in physics. So they do come from all walks of life. Some of them are rich, some of them are poor, some of them are very rich. Stephen Wolfram, for instance, has an outside
Computer
physics
man,
theory,
yeah.
and he even won a MacArthur Genius Award.
Yeah, it's astounding.
But they almost are university men.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you the final question about where all this goes, because you're leading up to the question of why in our age is this so clearly common now. You mentioned Lord Kelvin, who had some pretty strange ideas about whether something can be radioactive, rather strange about nuclear physics. There was also an astronomer royal who said that space travel would be impossible, and they could be proved very quickly very wrong, although Lord Kelvin went on to other glories. Now, what happens in a world where the outliers can become as significant, even politically, as orthodox science? In other words, they are turning up with their own facts, if you like, and in some ways negating orthodox science and trashing it in all sorts of important areas, which are making, I suppose, enlightenment and even progress impossible.
The people that I write in my book are outsiders in a specific vein. Their field is theoretical physics. Theoretical physics is a very particular kind of science. They see themselves as it were, offering alternatives to Einstein, string theory, and quantum theory. They are not in any way having any impact on anything that is a public policy issue. There are people who are putting forward outlying views negating climate change and objecting to evolution. And those people, particularly in the US, are having huge impacts on policy and increasingly on public education. I don't think that the people I write about will ever have any effect like that. I think what the people I'm writing about represent, however, is the difficulties that a lot of non-scientists are now having relating to science at all. And I think they are, in some sense, the positive end of a much darker spectrum, which is they are saying we love science, we believe it's the right way to understand the world. We can't understand the 10-dimensional theories that are coming out of things like string theory. We believe that nature speaks a language that the common man can understand. We will take science back for the people. They definitively want science for the people. Whereas climate change deniers and young Earth geologists,
World Trade Center truth people.
Yes, effectively want to deny science and the evidence of science. My people don't want to deny the evidence of science. They want the evidence to produce a science that is comprehensible. And I think this is a real interesting social question. Who is science for? I mean, it's for all of us in an instrumental sense. But if many people cannot understand the, as it were, theory of the world that the universe gives us, then they are completely left out of relating to science in a meaningful way. And that leads to a sort of frustration and a sense of deep alienation from the world. In that sense, they do share something, particularly with the young earthers and the evolution deniers.
So what do we do about that?
That's really where my book ends. I have some ideas about that. We need first to have sympathy and understanding of the position they're in.
And friendliness, like you were with Jim,
And friendliness.
instead of haughtiness.
Yes, well, the traditional term for these people has been cranks, which is just assuming that they're mad. I don't think these people are mad. I think the dilemma that they're facing is real, and we need to approach it with compassion and humanity. How we can solve it, I don't know. But I think that one of the things we need to do is to recognise that we have a problem.
We certainly have. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
That's going to be the all-time record there.